Hey there, it's Christian from 7Gamer Network, and I'm here with a review for this. It is Sanctuary, The Keeper's Era. It's a very lovely box. Now, this came onto the Kickstarter, and I was surprised at how cheap it was, considering how nice the package looked. So I'm going to tell you about what I think about the components now that we've actually got our hands on it, and most importantly, about the game. Is it really any good? Is it a lot of game in here for a little amount of money? Or did we just end up with a very small amount of game for not very much money? We'll find out as I go through this review. So once you get in here, there's some really nice stuff. This is the version that came with, in this lovely sort of slide out tray affair, that actually came with 4 rather nice playmats in there. I'll do a close-up of them so you can see them. But they're entirely functional mats, in the sense that they've put all of the different spaces on that you need to be identifying on your table to set up the cards in all the right places, and they've got some nice artwork on there that's very reminiscent of stuff that's actually on the cards. When it comes to the cards and the components themselves, yeah, they're pretty nice. Some of this art is really lovely. What I particularly like about the components in this game is that everything seems to have it's all very nicely tied together. There is a very good unification of the feel of everything. Okay, now you've got 6 different decks here, and each of them have their own sort of colour pie thing that they sort of fit into, and the theme is it's beautifully done throughout. The tokens, very nicely printed, very nicely made. It's all really good quality. The cards themselves, I mean, some people have been moaning about the thickness of the cards I've seen on a couple of forums. Ridiculous. They are beautiful cards, and ignore that if that's something that you're worried about. This is a very lovely put together thing. However, it's not perfect. One of the things that, although I've got to say, this box is really slick. I love this fold out thing across the top, having the tray, all that. This is very, very nice in terms of the presentation box. But there was this sheet that they printed out. I think there's just a few things that they thought, oh crumbs, we need to get a little bit more information in here about this, that or the other, that didn't find its way into the rule book. Now, your eyes do not deceive you. That is the entire size of the rule book. And I get the idea of having a small form rule book that you can essentially fit pretty much into one of the boxes. I mean, it really would fit inside one of the boxes. However, this is far too small. I mean, this is really, really small. It's also not brilliantly laid out, so it's quite difficult to find certain rules, which for a quite simple game was mildly frustrating, to say the least. So this was a bit of a misfire. It will be handy, and it would be really nice as maybe a sort of a Kickstarter bonus type thing if you still had a nice big full-size proper rule book that you could read. This doesn't do the job. Would have been a nice bonus extra. So that was definitely a misfire when it came to the components. But all in all, this is a really nicely put together thing, and my real quibble is just with the rule book. Okay, so what we really want to know is, well, is it any good? And now I'm going to talk about, as I always do, what I liked about it and what I didn't like about it. And firstly, what I liked about it, it's simple. In fact, that forms really partly what I really like about it and what I really don't like about it. I think Sanctuary's simplicity is at the same time its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. Why is it good? Well, it's very focused. You've got these 6 decks. There's only 28 cards in each. It means that you can really clearly see a deck has a strategy and how you're going to play it. So when you sit down to play, You don't have a great amount of rules, even though the little rule book doesn't do a great job of getting you through learning those rules. But once you're sitting down to play, it's an easy game to teach someone else. And to get playing because of these already made up for you focused decks. And because they've got a very focused strategy, it's quite easy to get into to feel like I'm playing this deck properly. You know, this is how I'm meant to be playing this deck. And that does feel quite rewarding. And as well, the simplicity certainly means I think it's going to be a good gateway game. It's a great game for teaching people things like, hey, this is a deck that has a very clear strategy. This is a deck where it focuses on its discard pile and putting things in and taking things out. Or this is a deck that focuses on movement and moving my cards around. Oh, I get this notion. So from a teaching point of view, I really loved it. It was great. My 6-year-old absolutely loved playing games of this with me because he could cotton on immediately to what it was he's meant to do with his deck. And there's a lot of enjoyment in having a very focused deck, of course. But I'll come back to the notion of having a focused deck, deck building and more, on maybe some of the things I wasn't so keen on. The sanctuaries themselves, the actual 4 cards that you've got that are essentially your life points, they've got some cool mechanics on, and actually it's a fairly interesting little twist. Adds to the game, adds some complexity, and it does also have to be built into your strategy because of how their ability won't come into play until they've decayed to the point, although calling it decay, that's kind of weird. They had to decay to a certain point and then you could start using them. That didn't feel quite right, but once you've got the ability, that works its way into your strategy very nicely. And of course, one of the things that you're doing when you're playing then is you're trying to work out, well, when is my opponent's sanctuaries going to come online, and when are they going to start getting these extra abilities? And seeing that those are coming was quite nice. I did enjoy working my way around that. Okay, so what maybe did I not like about it so much? Well, as I said, it's a very simple game, and I think the simplicity means that you're going to get to the bottom of your deck, no pun intended, in terms of its strategy and how you're going to play it, probably quite quickly. And I think that that can possibly mean that I don't know that the longevity of this is necessarily so great. Now I know they certainly addressed it in terms of things like, well, hang on a second, you can do some deck building. But as someone who's played a lot of Magic the Gathering and, you know, Netrunner and Pokemon and those kind of games over the years, where your deck building is a science and an art. What you want to see in games like this, you want to see very few restrictions. And the challenge is that they came in with a big old restriction of you can only have one card. You can't have more than one card in any of the decks that you deck build. And you actually build from only 3 factions when you come to do it as well. So it actually makes it very restricted. Now that is because you're only playing with 28 cards as well, admittedly. And maybe, and again, this is where I'm saying the simplicity of playing with 28 cards and where they only have 2 copies of each in the deck. It is a strength, but also it's a real weakness because it feels like such a limitation when you want to then come to do deck building. And because you're only playing 28 cards, they kind of have to have the thing of, look, you can only pick one of any card you're going to play because, and this is another thing that I found really quite difficult, it's really obvious the cards that are very good as opposed to the cards that just aren't as good. And when you've only got 28 cards in the deck, it becomes, as they've set them up, and of course the deck building doesn't really do enough to change it because it's still only one card of each, it just becomes a race to draw out your stronger cards. Now again, in 28 cards, you've got a good chance of seeing in a typical game a lot of them. But the challenge is that if the other person just sees their stronger cards in their suit, in their faction earlier on, then you've got an uphill struggle through the game. And that kind of balancing is really frustrated me, because you can see how, yes, if you played 1,000 matches, it would balance out, like it's balanced over 1,000 matches, but it's not balanced in individual games, it doesn't feel like. And that was really particularly a thing that I didn't like about Sanctuary. Now, in terms of somewhat addressing some of the longevity issues, they do actually talk about, and they do have a mode of like a campaign play. And you can do as like a solo campaign, which I have to say, it was lackluster for me. Now, I'm not one who massively enjoys lots of solo gaming anyway, but for me, there really wasn't enough to make me keep coming back and trying to build my decks and adjust my deck as I was going through that campaign. And therefore that was also actually kind of the same when it came to doing 1v1 campaign. I wasn't really impressed with my options, as it were, for upgrading my deck and making it feel like I was making real change to the way that this deck was going to play out. And again, that was it. It was a nice Kickstarter bonus kind of idea, but you can tell that it's just not really the heart of this game and how it's meant to be played. It still comes back down to the 1v1 dueling, as it kind of always does with these kind of strategy card games. And this is another area where I felt the focus on the certain strategies, whilst again it was in some ways a strength, the individual strategies, they just weren't necessarily particularly well executed. Take the Antar, for instance, as one faction and their theme, and how actually playing out their tactic, their strategy, was actually slightly awkward, because what their deck is built around is your opponent's exhausted units. When your opponent has exhausted units, you can do and gain various benefits and bonuses, and you would think therefore then that your ability to exhaust their units would be fairly commonplace in your deck. And out of 28 cards in the Antar deck, only 8 cards actually exhaust their units. It's relatively feasible that you can go through a whole game and not see a single card that actually causes their units to be exhausted over and above your Sanctuary, which is only going to do 1 a turn. And so you've got an entire faction here that's built around prosecuting something against their opponent, that they actually have very, very few cards in their deck that allow them to put that situation into place on the table. So it becomes awkward, whereas some of the other decks, their strategies are a little more straightforward and a little more easy to do, and so you actually will get a lot more success when you try and apply their strategy than you would, for example, the Antar. And so all of this really results in a game that feels like I suppose the epitome of style over substance. It is a game that is beautiful and it's wonderful components, and it is very, very lovely to behold and to play with, but ultimately it's a bit of a sweet sugar hit rather than a satisfying meal. Kind of, it burns fairly brightly whilst you're learning the decks and trying to experience the individual strategies of each of the decks. But once you start running into this, I'm just racing to get my best cards, and so is my opponent. Once you realise that, I've kind of got this deck down, and well, I'm not sure that this one can prosecute its strategy as well as that one, you'll realise that then you'll want to do deck building, and then you'll realise it's just not going to happen. This is not a game for deck building, not just because you can only have 1 of each card, but actually the decks are quite focused in their strategies, and actually when you mix those together you just end up diluting the strategy of the deck that you are trying to build, and so it kind of is counterproductive really to having a good strategy. So there we have it. It's a review for Sanctuary, the Keeper's Era. Now if you found it helpful in terms of maybe choosing, is this going to be a game you're going to add to your collection for you and your gaming group, please do click like, maybe hit subscribe for more of this kind of stuff in future, and until next time, keep enjoying your gaming. Thank you.